In a few weeks' time, heads of state, regulators, financiers, and corporate executives will all head to Brazil for the annual United Nations Climate Change Conference known as COP30. It's likely to be a subdued affair. After a burst of activity and urgency and optimism in recent years, the battle to stop global warming has, it's fair to say, suffered some setbacks. This year, President Donald Trump has withdrawn the United States from the Paris Agreement for the second time. His administration has cancelled subsidies for green energy and other programs introduced by former President Joe Biden. Last month, Trump told the United Nations that climate change was the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. Meanwhile, banks, insurers, and asset managers, which had joined forces in a bid to ease the path to net zero, have largely abandoned those associations. Carbon emissions are still rising, and yet all of this is happening while the evidence that the planet is warming up becomes ever more tangible. At the same time, there are still signs of progress. Solar panels and batteries continue to get cheaper, in large part led by Chinese manufacturers, and the European Union will next year introduce its carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will attach a price to the embedded carbon emissions in goods imported into the EU. Even then, it's increasingly clear that limiting the effects of global warming now requires countries not to just reduce their emissions, but also to find ways of removing large quantities of carbon which are already in the Earth's atmosphere. So this week on The Big View, we're going to take stock of the fight against climate change. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest stories in economics, business, and finance. I'm your host, Peter Thal-Larsen. And to talk about all of this, I'm delighted to welcome Adair Turner onto the show. Adair is chairman of the Energy Transitions Commission, a global coalition of major power and industrial companies, investors, non-governmental organizations, and experts. He was previously chairman of the UK Financial Services Authority, redesigning bank regulation after the financial crisis in 2008. He was also Director General of the Confederation of British Industry, among many other roles. He's chairman of the insurance group Chubb Europe, chairman of Oak North Bank, and a director of the battery company AESC Japan. And for the purpose of this conversation, he chairs the Working Group on Carbon Pricing and Markets for the Group of 30, a collection of current and former central bankers, financial regulators, and academics, which recently published a report on carbon pricing and markets. Adair Turner, welcome to The Big View.
Thank you for having me.
So, Adair, in a couple of weeks, we've got the big United Nations, the annual climate change conference in Brazil coming up. I think it's fair to say that the fight against global warming is on the ropes somewhat at the moment. How would you describe the general mood among the people that you work with on this issue?
Well, when I try and sum up where we are on climate change and the energy transition, I think of three things which go bad, and very good. The bad is that, we have not yet got CO2 or other greenhouse gas emissions on a downward trend. So the concentrations of gases in the atmosphere is going up and the temperature is going up. And I think, sadly, this means that although we've talked about limiting global warming ideally to 1.5 degrees centigrade, it's going to be almost impossible to achieve that. But it is still possible to limit it to well below 2 degrees centigrade. And that's a really important thing to do. But so we are not where we want to be, not where we hoped to be 5 years ago in terms of the global emissions reduction pathway. It is also true to say that the politics from America is very, very bad and has surprised me about how bad it was. I always knew that Donald Trump has no interest in dealing with climate change and was not going to support or reinforce what the Biden administration had done in terms of emission reduction targets or support for new clean technology. But I have been surprised that that has turned into deliberate animus against renewables, including things like deliberately putting an end to offshore wind farms, which had been 50% constructed, things that make no economic sense at all. So one has to realize that the politics is really deliberately trying to create global warming. I mean, it can't. I don't think it can quite be that, but it's very strong. However, the politics outside the US, I think, probably will disappoint the US administration, because I think they thought that if they pulled out of the Paris process and said climate change isn't a problem, a whole load of other countries would say the same. That hasn't happened at all. And the vast majority of countries are going to get together in Belém to reinforce the fact that we still do believe climate change is a problem, and we've got to work out how to deal with it, even without America. So that's a bit of a nuance on the politics, but the direction of the politics compared with a year ago is very unfavorable because of the US.
Mm.
The technologies, however, what is happening is a series of technologies, solar photovoltaics, wind, and now most dramatically batteries, are coming down in cost and increasing in performance far faster than
Mm.
we previously anticipated. We are far ahead of where I thought we would be 5 years ago. And this means that we are sitting on the potential for really an accelerated energy transition, in particular in some parts of the world. I mean, I think Africa now has an opportunity to grow an electricity system rapidly, which never relies on fossil fuels. And I think we can say that now in a way that we couldn't say 10 years ago. Electric vehicles have got dramatically better. In China, they are now cheaper than internal combustion engines. There's really no reason why in future people are ever going to buy internal combustion engines again, because EVs are just going to be better. So the climate, bad. The politics, bad, but probably less bad than the Trump administration hoped, because of the determination of other countries to stick to the path. And the technology is giving us the tools to deal with this problem to a much greater extent than we dared hope 10 years ago.
And that's very interesting. And the technology point is a good one, and something we should come back to. Also, the geopolitics of that technology is also very interesting. I just wanted to pick talk a bit about carbon pricing, though, because you chair this group for the G30, which wrote this big report about carbon pricing and trading carbon permits. It seems like this has been a sort of holy grail amongst economists who think about global warming for ages, and we're going right back to Nicholas Stern's seminal report on global warming, and yet it's never quite sort of come to fruition in the way that people expected. How do you explain that?
Well, look, in the Group of 30 report, which we've just produced on carbon pricing and carbon markets, dealing both with the issues relating to carbon emission trading schemes and taxes, and also the whole issue about removal credits,
Mm.
we start by observing that, 20 years ago, a lot of economists wrote theoretical pieces that said climate change is an externality. The answer to an externality is to have a carbon price. This goes back to the great economist Pigou, Pigovian externality pricing, as it's called. You have a carbon price, and as long as you price it, the free market will solve all problems. And it's true to say that so far, carbon pricing, somewhat surprisingly to some, has only played a very small role in the transition to lower emissions technologies in the places where we've seen it. And I think we now have a much more nuanced understanding than that sort of initial, theoretical neoclassical economist. It's all got to be about carbon pricing. What we understand is that there are many sectors of the economy where carbon pricing may not be required or may not be the optimal instrument. So if you're trying to persuade individuals to buy electric vehicles to get them going initially, doing a carbon price on increasing the cost of diesel or petrol is an indirect way to do that. It has political sensitivity, as we saw with the yellow vest movements in France. It doesn't directly affect people's decision. Probably better to have subsidies for the initial purchase of electric vehicles to get it going. And in the long run, not necessary, because electric vehicles are going to be cheaper and better than internal combustion engines. So you have a sector of the economy where you won't need a carbon price in the long term, and where to get the thing going, to get the industry going, the economies of scale, the learning curve effects, which drive the price of the product down, other instruments better than carbon pricing. And that is broadly true, I think, of a lot of sectors to do with the direct use of electricity, in applications of heat pumps in place of domestic gas boilers, etc.
Mm.
The good news is that across a lot of those direct uses of electricity, probably 70% of the economy, 70% of emissions, in the long term, the new clean technologies will be lower cost. But where we desperately need carbon pricing, and where I think we will increasingly focus the debate, is that there are sectors of the economy which we can't electrify. These are things like long distance shipping, long distance aviation, the production of cement, the production of primary iron. And in these sectors of the economy, there's a set of reasons which we set out in the Group of 30 report to believe that carbon pricing of some form will be necessary in the long term and is a very efficient instrument. It will be necessary in the long term because in these sectors, there may be a green cost premium forever. In these sectors, it may be more expensive to do shipping in a zero carbon fashion, not just temporarily and in transition, but forever. And it's more efficient because in these sectors, you have professional purchasers of energy who make decisions about which energy to buy by working out on Excel spreadsheets, the relative cost of option A versus option B. And those are people who, if you change the cost of one of the inputs by a carbon price, it changes their model and they do different things. When you go to, the ordinary household saying, I've got a gas boiler, people tell me I've got to go to a heat pump, ordinary people don't sit down of an evening and, do an Excel spreadsheet with alternative courses of action, discounting the future with an appropriate risk-adjusted discount rate. I mean, this is stuff that professional managers do. So carbon pricing is going to be much more effective in these heavy, energy-intensive, big emitting industries, and is likely to be required or equivalent regulation even in the long term. So what we do in this G30 report is try to say, let's get beyond this either or of either you're a theoretical economist that believes that carbon pricing, by pricing the externality, is going to do everything, or carbon pricing hasn't worked, let's do something else. Understand that the relative role of carbon pricing and the optimal role will vary by sectors of the economy.
So, so how would that work in practice then? I mean, I can understand that you introduce a carbon price and you shift the incentives, and as you say, those people with the spreadsheets and the discount rates then kind of adjust their decisions. But given the difficulties that there have been in terms of getting carbon pricing up and running, how would you sort of, just in a practical sense, what would be the sort of your advice on how to get this up and running?
Well, look, there is one major application of carbon pricing across the world today
Mm.
at carbon prices significant enough to be serious. And this is the EU emission trading scheme. So the EU emission trading scheme covers the whole of the power sector, and it covers the whole of the heavy industry sector. And it is now generating prices of, fluctuates, but maybe 70, 90 euros a ton, which are prices at which you can expect significant changes in behavior. And that has been introduced in the European Union, and it is effectively there. The challenge, of course, in the heavy industry is that if you simply apply carbon pricing to iron production in Europe, in the European Union, but not in Turkey or not in India or not in China, then the you will have an incentive to decarbonize within Europe, but they will be undercut by people still producing carbon intensive iron made cheaply from coking coal in India or Turkey or China. We initially in the European Union said, okay, the way to make sure we don't have that harmful offset, the undermining effect, is by giving the heavy industries what's called free allowances. But of course, that reduces their incentive to respond to the carbon price. And Europe is quite rightly now switching to a system where it says we're going to remove those free allowances. You're an iron maker in Europe, you're a cement producer. You really are going to have to pay the carbon price on all your emissions, but protecting those industries with a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which says if there's an import of steel from China, which is made in the old-fashioned, high carbon fashion, it's going to face the same price at the border as the domestic European producer faces inside. And we are now in Europe on a sort of 8-year transition where the free allowances are being phased out and the CBAM is being phased in. So one of the ways that this carbon pricing could spread more widely is that this creates a very strong incentive effect for other countries to introduce carbon prices. Because if you are now in India or in China and you say, well, my iron makers, my steel makers are paying a carbon price at the border to go into Europe, and you're the government, you think, well, hang on, why don't I get that revenue by imposing a carbon price at home? And so the aim of the CBAM has always been to set up a strong incentive structure for China, India, all the other developing countries themselves to introduce carbon prices, at least for their heavy industries at home. The good news is that I think this incentive structure is now working actually to a greater extent than I anticipated. I have to say, I've had a lot of engagements with, for instance, Chinese policymakers. 5 years ago on the CBAM, you'd be in a meeting with Chinese policymakers and they would say, this is not acceptable, it's against WTO rules, it's protectionist. And now they broadly say, given that Europe is going to have a CBAM, we should have our own carbon pricing applying to the iron sector, and we should decarbonize our own iron and steel production. And indeed, in just a few weeks' time, I will be in China with the China Iron and Steel Research Institute. They're taking me to look at some hydrogen direct reduction plants in China, cutting edge technology of producing iron in a zero carbon fashion. And they're very interested in talking to the Energy Transition Commission, which I chair, about the role of carbon pricing. We are beginning to see carbon pricing spread in India. Singapore is increasing a very serious carbon price. So I think this process of Europe started and then others will respond to the CBAM is one of the ways that we will get this spread of carbon pricing across the world. In China at the moment, there is a carbon pricing regime, but at the moment, for heavy industry, it essentially has free allowances. But that's where Europe started. These things go through a transition, and I think we will see an accelerated transition of China towards it.
Yeah, that's really interesting and sort of encouraging. I think. I mean, obviously the EU has been at this for a couple of decades. I think in terms of sort of the pricing and the trading. I mean, there've been some problems there, right? I mean, there have been problems with the over allocation of permits. The price was very volatile. They had to sort of make some adjustments along the way. What sort of lessons have the Europeans learned that might help help other countries do this in a slightly smoother way?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, the European Emissions Trading Scheme, I forget the exact date, but it goes back to sort of even 2005 or even earlier. It's been going for a couple of decades. And for quite some time, originally, the price that it was generating was not enough to make much difference. It was sort of $15 a ton. At that level, you might somewhat influence operational decisions about whether to run a coal powered plant or a gas fired plant, decisions at the margin as to which plant you run each day, but you won't shift long-term investment decisions with that sort of carbon price. And it's only in the last 5 years or so that we've seen the carbon price go to serious levels. So
Hmm.
what occurred in that transition? One thing that occurred was after the global financial crisis of 2008, there was such a reduction in economic activity that the emissions which were actually being put out in any
Yeah.
case came down relative to the cap. And if the emissions fall relative to the cap, then there's no tightness in the system. The demand isn't there for the supply. And I think the European Union should probably earlier have adjusted the cap down, but over time, the European Union has adjusted the cap down. The European Union now has a very clear pathway of reduction of the emissions which will be allowable in the scheme, heading essentially to around net zero, by around 2040. And one of the things I always say when I'm talking, for instance, to Chinese or other counterparts about this, until you get to a stage where your government has set an absolute total limit, described not in emissions intensity terms or best technology standards, but in terms of just millions of tons of carbon. It's this year, and next year it's going to be lower, and the year lower it's going to be lower, and still. Until you do that, you can't really generate a really effective forward price for carbon. And in order to influence people's decisions, you want a forward price for carbon as well as a spot price. So took some time for the European Union to tighten its cap and to make it clear how it was going to decline over the long term. But that is there now. And we have a very serious system which can generate future as well as spot prices. The other thing which was problematic to start with was what was called the Clean Development Mechanism. The Clean Development Mechanism said, well, okay, you could buy a credit within the with European system out of the amounts of emission, trading rights which existed, or you can go fund a project somewhere else in the world which reduces emissions relative to best practice. And this is the whole idea of trade in carbon offsets. The trouble is, I think that the initial version of this, and almost everybody would say this, was far too slack. It was slack in terms of the definition of additionality, by which I mean you had people who would go to a Chinese, industrial site which was producing a lot of, HFC, a very small quantity, very high impact greenhouse gases, and would say, I will pay you because you will reduce those emissions. The trouble is, these were going to be reduced in any case because the latest generation of technology made it almost costless to reduce them. So you were just playing around, paying somebody a small amount of money to do something they were going to do any case in order to avoid having to pay something in Europe. And that also contributed to the slackness of the system. There was also an allowance at that stage to buy offsets in the nature-based solution space to say, I've paid somebody not to deforest. The moment you sow those words, it's pretty obvious you've created a pretty big moral hazard for somebody to tell you that he was about to deforest and you've got to stop them doing it. And so there were all these carbon credits being presented where people increasingly got worried about, are they truly additional? Are we truly getting that avoidance of deforestation, etc.? And what happened was that by 2020, the European Union said, well, we're taking that out entirely, right? We're not going to have these offsets. This is an entirely European scheme. And that has been part of the tightening up of the European system. Now, I think we've now got to the stage, and we argue for it in our Group of 30 report, that having tightened up to get rid of all the rubbish, there could be a legitimate role for allowing a small amount of high quality removal trading to occur within a compliance scheme. So now we have people saying, okay, this isn't an offset of something that's going to happen in any case. This is a real removal. I'm doing direct air capture. or I'm doing reforestation with really high standards that it does occur, it's measurable. We need those projects to occur because without some level of removals, we will not be able to reduce net emissions fast enough to meet even well below 2 degrees centigrade, let alone 1.5 degrees centigrade. We need those to occur. They will only occur if somebody's paid for them. So in our Group of 30 report, we say the stage has now come to reallow within EUTS a proportion, a small proportion. We're talking more about 3 or 5% of the credits to be met by buying those sort of high quality credits in order to create a revenue stream that can support the development of that. So what this other problem was that the whole CDM mechanism was an approach to offsetting credits, which was far too slack and which frankly allowed people to pay money for what in retrospect many people I think legitimately think were little more than scams.
Yeah. So I mean, this removal point is interesting. I mean, I do remember sort of there being quite a lot of criticism of this idea in the past. I remember, for example, you had big oil companies which would in their sort of their planning for how they were going to get to net zero would say, well, we're going to continue to sort of pump oil and there'll be all these emissions, but don't worry, in the future we will there will be lots of carbon capture and storage and removal from the atmosphere, which will then make it all okay. And people were quite skeptical about that, I think it's fair to say. I mean, why should we be less skeptical about that idea now?
Well, I think the crucial thing we need both stretching targets to bring down gross emissions. And the only way to do that is to consume less fossil fuels. We've got to take coal completely out of the power system. We've got to radically reduce the role of gas in the power system, though it may exist as a small backup in the long term. We've got to take oil out of road transport. So we can't avoid the fact that we've got to have a dramatic reductions in gross emissions, and it was very important to move away from what was you are quite right, in some of the fossil fuel company models, which is, oh, well, I'll just keep on producing fossil fuels at something like the current level, and I'll plug into my model that in 2050 I'll be doing 15 gigatons of removal, so it's okay, really, right? You have to have clear agreed pathways that we're actually going to use electric vehicles, not internal combustion engine vehicles, use renewables or nuclear, not coal. But you've also got to realize that even if we do that as fast as we possibly can, we will need removals as well to hit climate targets. We'll need them because there are some residual sectors of the economy where it will be very difficult to go all the way to net zero. Now, for instance, unless we literally cut out all red meat, use entirely, we will be putting some methane emissions up there, and you're going to have to offset them somewhere. And I think that will have to be some category of removals. I think in the UK power system, we believe at the ETC now, there may be a very small role for unabated gas. And I'm literally talking about running for 3% of all the hours in the year to simply cover the provision of electricity when there's a huge anticyclone in the North Sea and we've lost our wind. Trying to solve that problem without a reserve of gas turbines may be prohibitively expensive. And that may produce, 10 million tons a year of CO2 emissions, and we may offset that with removals. So we do need removals. We need them for specific things that we won't be able to get to absolute zero. And as long as we're getting the overall gross emissions down 90 to 95%, it doesn't matter if the last 5% is removed. So that's changed. That's changed our thinking about the role of removals. But also what has happened is that there has been a lot of work has gone in, for instance, through something called the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets and other groups, to really tighten up on the definition of what carbon credits are. And in the Group of 30 report, we talk about the activities of these setters. There's an understanding that we should be primarily over time talking about actual removals, not offsets versus business as usual. It's always the moment you say you're doing something which has improved, performance relative to business as usual, you've got a big problem of how you define business as usual. So we need to head towards, we really want to see CO2 removed from the atmosphere. But I do think that we were right to be skeptical about the models that plugged in huge amount of removals. We were right to be skeptical about a lot of the low standard and low quality offsets which people bought at low cost in the past. But I think we have now really understood the role that removals and a small category of offsets, we might come back to that, should play. We have standards to define it. And I think we are now at a stage where we need to encourage that, confident we know how to use them without them being abused.
Okay, that's clear. I just want to come back to, I mean, you talked at the beginning about the tremendous advances that have been in solar technology, batteries, and so forth. I just want to just explore a little bit the sort of the geopolitics of that, because clearly a lot of this is coming. China has been very successful at sort of making big advances in these technologies, and there is an increasing uh, anxiety, nervousness in Europe and elsewhere about being too dependent on Chinese supply chains. To what extent should you try and sort of replicate this at home? And I just wonder sort of how you think that plays out, and whether there's a risk here that in trying to focus on security of supply chains, that undermines the sort of the potential progress on the climate front.
Well, there clearly is a danger here. You're absolutely right that if we look at all the core technologies, solar PV, batteries, wind turbines, now electrolyzers, EVs, China is in a dominant position and has become more dominant over the last 4 years. I think that sometimes, in Europe you hear, or in America, that's all just due to current subsidies. I think that's a misunderstanding. What has happened is a set of strategic commitments to develop these industries at scale, brilliant R&D and innovation, brilliant entrepreneurship, where in each of these industries you get private companies that beat the hell out of each other on competition, the development of economy of scale and learning curve effects, and that then creates a structural cost position which is now it exists even if the current subsidies are removed. It no longer depends on current subsidies. It has been created by this process of creating a structural cost advantage. So it's there. And in a world of complete geopolitical peace and no worries about employment and security, we'd all be applauding this and saying, isn't this fantastic? We've now got solar panels at 90% less cost than 10 years ago, batteries at 90% less cost. But of course, in the real world, it goes, well, isn't this a problem to be so reliant on one country? And at the Energy Transition Commission, we produced a report, a set of proposals in May this year, setting out a set of principles that we think should apply, for instance, in Europe, thinking about China dominance, trying to get beyond either this is great and welcome and don't worry, or it's all a disaster. Now, what are those principles? I think one, there's a lot to be said for developing your own supply chains to a degree, but it's idiotic to go for complete autarky, right? The European Net Zero Industrial Act had a phrase that the aim would be to make sure that we were not more than 50% reliant for our supply on any one supplier. That's not a bad, definition of diversification. That's point one. The second point is we really have to be intelligent about security. And the term security is used in a very vague fashion. Sometimes we're talking about really techie intelligence and military security, and sometimes about economic. If you're talking techie and military security, you've got to draw a distinction between different types of product. look, and I say this openly to Chinese friends and colleagues, I say you have to realize that if we're talking about a Chinese software company wanting to provide the central control software of a European electricity grid, the European government is highly likely and very wise to ask its intelligence services whether this is a good idea or not, and they're likely to say no, right? Let's be honest, that's the world in which we live. At the other end, if you're worried that solar panels have listening devices picking up your comments as you wander through the countryside, you're living in a paranoid, world. So let's try and work out where there are real security concerns and where there aren't. The other aspect of security, I sometimes hear people say, oh, relying on Chinese solar panels, that's just like relying on Russian gas. Well, actually, it's just exactly not like relying on Russian gas. If you rely on Russian gas and you suddenly end up in a war situation like in Ukraine, on the day that starts, you can end up cold because you've got no Russian gas. If one hopes not, we end up in a real geopolitical conflict, with China over Taiwan, and we no longer get solar PV panels from them. You've got all the solar PV panels that you bought in the past producing lots and lots of electricity. Indeed, if you really thought that we were in danger of getting into that situation, the logical strategy should be to buy as many and stockpile them as rapidly as possible. So you've got to be intelligent. You've got to think through what you're really talking about when you talk about reliance. You've also, I think, got to, this is our third principle, you've got to draw a distinction between different sectors. On solar PV, Europe has no employment effectively at risk. We produce almost no solar PV. And I think it would take an fortune to try and subsidize our way to producing cheap solar PV. And we probably still would be more expensive than the Chinese. So on solar PV, probably sensible just to buy the solar PV from China. On the other hand, there's something about batteries and electric vehicles. We have a large employment base at risk in internal combustion engines. So we'd like to try to replace that. EVs and batteries tend to go together. The best place to put a battery factory is right next to an EV factory. So there's a complicated interrelationship there. And those factors suggest that with some intelligent strategy, we might be able to have a vibrant European battery and EV manufacturing industry in a way which is unlikely on solar PV panels. But, fourth principle, if you're trying to build that that battery and EV capability in Europe, probably sensible to focus primarily on location of activity, not on ownership. So Stellantis are doing a joint venture with the big Chinese battery company CATL to build batteries in Spain. Probably a sensible thing to do. If we want cheap EVs in the UK, ahead of our proposal to ban internal combustion engines in 2030, if BYD wanted to build an EV manufacturing plant in the UK, my own belief is we should be as welcoming to that as we have been to Nissan and Toyota. And let's be clear, when China was behind technologically in the 1990s, what was one of the biggest things it did? It encouraged inward investment, sometimes in the form of JVs, as a way of getting technology transfer and learning, and then it was going to catch up. I think we need also to, if we are going to have tariffs, and we do have tariffs in Europe now on EVs, they should be set on the basis of some facts and in line with WTO guidelines, rather than in America just sort of picked out of Donald Trump's brain, whatever he happened to think about that morning. And finally, China and Europe together should be working together to unleash the flows of finance, which enable places like Africa, low-income countries, to buy, this new wonderful technology on a massive scale.
Just this is really interesting. I just want to maybe to finish up, just want to get your view on one very topical thing, which is the the power demand from artificial intelligence. I mean, there's literally every day there's a new announcement about someone spending tens of billions of dollars building data centers, or ordering chips, and obviously the power associated with that is very substantial. Just with the sort of climate change, from a climate change perspective, how do you think about that? Is that undermining some of these other efforts? Just I wonder, how do you see that
Look, I
changing the
think it's a
picture?
short term. I think it's a short term challenge. I think there's two important things to say. One, it doesn't radically change the long term picture, and B, it has a huge uncertainty. It
Mhm.
doesn't radically change the long term picture in the sense that in order to have a zero carbon economy and in order to spread prosperity across the world to people who don't yet enjoy the benefit of energy and in particular electricity, we will probably in any case want to take total global electricity demand and supply from 30,000 terawatt hours to 70,000 by mid-century, and it wouldn't at all surprise me if it doubles again in the subsequent 50 years. The future is electric, and it's going to need a lot of electricity. So let's say we're going from 30 to 70,000. As we play around, as everybody plays around with how much electricity might AI need, there are people out there with estimates of 3,000 terawatt hours, 5,000 terawatt hours. It's a lot, but it doesn't completely transform the fact that we're going to have to go from 30 to 70,000. It is, however, occurring early fast. And the issue of how we make sure that even though it's early fast, it's happening as much as possible with renewables, with nuclear, maybe small modular nuclear, with batteries as backup, not with fossil fuels. It's important, but in the long term, it's not transformational. The other thing to say is that it is highly uncertain. There's a very good analytical group. It's really a one-man band, but I don't know how he does all the work he does, called Thunderset Energy, run by Rob West, who churns out excellent analysis. It's very interesting. Between 2 years, between 2023 and 2024, or maybe it was 24 or 25, I forget, he produced estimates of how much electricity would be needed for training and inference of AI models. And during the course of that year, as he was trying to gather all the information on how much training and inference would be going on, measured in exaflops of activity, he multiplied those exaflops of training and inference 10 times. But when he got to working out how many kilowatt hours you'd need per exaflop, he picked up the fact that there were all sorts of breakthroughs in software and hardware efficiency, which meant that he reduced his estimate by 90% of the energy intensity. So the demand went up, 10 times. The energy intensity came down 90%, and the figure he ended up with is exactly the same. So he ended up with exactly the same forecast as a result of 10 times up, 10 times down. And I think we just have to reflect that this is inherently uncertain. We
Mm.
are dealing with an explosive growth of the underlying number of calculations and activities going on in the AI training and inference space. But I think we are just right at the beginning of the ability of the chip designers, the software designers to do this in a more energy efficient fashion. But to go back to my first point, it won't fundamentally transform how much electricity we need across the global economy in the long term, because that's going to go up a lot in any case. But whatever it is, it's a big demand in the short term, and we've got to manage that in as clean a way as possible.
Okay, Adair, this has been great. We could talk for much longer, I'm sure, on this and many other issues, but we have to leave it there. So thank you again very much for your time, and I hope you come back from Brazil in a more optimistic frame of mind than you go into it. But we'd be interesting to see what the outcome is from there. But thanks again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So that's our show this week. Thanks very much to Adair for that fascinating discussion. And as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tasich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday, and don't forget to tune in to our sister show Viewsroom every Thursday, as well as all the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. To get in touch with feedback, questions, and ideas, please email us at breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. That's breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. If you like what you heard, please rate the show and leave us a review. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.